In the autumn of 1944, a damaged M18 Hellcat tank destroyer was captured intact near the Hürtgen forest and transported under armed guard to the Kummersdorf proving grounds south of Berlin. What arrived was not just another American vehicle. It was a technological paradox that would haunt German engineering pride for the remainder of the war and decades beyond. The Hellcat weighed 18 tons. German tank destroyers of comparable firepower weighed twice that. The contradiction was so severe that senior engineers initially suspected the Americans had stripped the vehicle of essential components before abandonment. They had not. The machine was complete, fully operational, and represented a philosophy of war that German industry had either ignored or deemed impossible. The Hellcat had been designed not to withstand hits, but to avoid them entirely. Its armor was thin, laughably so by German standards, yet it could reach speeds exceeding 55 miles per hour on open terrain. It carried a 76mm gun capable of penetrating the frontal armor of a Panther tank at medium range. It required a crew of 5, consumed fuel at half the rate of a Panther, and could be produced in a fraction of the time. To the engineers at Kummersdorf, the vehicle was an insult wrapped in riveted steel. It suggested that mass, thickness, and brute engineering, the pillars of German armored doctrine, were not virtues but liabilities. The question that paralyzed the examination team was simple and unbearable. How had the Americans built something so light, so fast, and so lethal when Germany's best minds had concluded such a combination was structurally unsound? The disassembly began on a cold November morning. The Hellcat was photographed from every angle, measured with calipers and micrometers, stripped bolt by bolt under the supervision of Dr. Heinrich Vormann, a metallurgist who had spent the previous 3 years refining the armor composition of the Tiger II. Vormann's initial assessment, recorded in a classified memorandum dated November 12, 1944, was clinical and damning. The vehicle's armor plating averages 12 to 25 millimeters in thickness. By our standards, this is insufficient to resist even medium-caliber anti-tank fire. Yet the structural integrity of the chassis suggests the Americans have achieved a strength-to-weight ratio we cannot replicate with current alloys. The memo did not circulate beyond the technical staff. It was filed, stamped, and buried under the weight of a war that no longer had time for uncomfortable truths. But the disassembly continued. Engineers removed the engine, a Continental R975, a radial aircraft engine adapted for ground use. It was air-cooled, compact, and reliable. German tank engines were liquid-cooled, complex, and prone to failure in freezing conditions. The transmission was semi-automatic, reducing crew fatigue and mechanical strain. The suspension used torsion bars that allowed for rapid movement over uneven terrain without sacrificing stability. Every system had been designed with a single priority: speed of deployment, speed of maneuver, speed of production. The Hellcat was not built to last. It was built to win quickly, and if destroyed, to be replaced within weeks. This was a doctrine Germany could not afford to adopt. Its factories were burning. Its workforce was conscripted or dead. The Reich had staked everything on individual superiority, and the Hellcat proved that quantity, when intelligently designed, could massacre quality. The families of the engineers involved in the examination would later recall a shift in their loved ones during those months. Vormann's wife described him as silent and pale after long days at Kummersdorf. He stopped discussing his work entirely. Another engineer, Klaus Ritter, a specialist in armor welding, told his brother in a letter dated January 1945, "We are dissecting a philosophy, not a machine, and it is winning." The letter was intercepted by military censors and never delivered. Ritter disappeared into the chaos of the war's final months. His body was never identified. The Hellcat examination report, a 400-page technical autopsy, was completed in February 1945. It concluded that replicating the vehicle's design would require a complete restructuring of German industrial doctrine, retooling of factories, and adoption of lighter, more flexible alloys that Germany no longer had the resources to produce. The report was read by fewer than a dozen men. None of them had the authority to act on its findings. By March, Soviet forces were within striking distance of Berlin. The Kummersdorf facility was evacuated. The captured Hellcat, along with its disassembled components, was loaded onto a rail car and sent west toward American lines in a desperate attempt to prevent its recapture by the Soviets. The rail car never arrived. It was destroyed in an air raid near Magdeburg. The technical report survived. Fragments of it were recovered by American intelligence officers in 1946, translated and filed among thousands of other captured documents. For decades, it remained unread in a storage facility in Maryland. When it was finally declassified in 1973, historians noted the tone of the document, precise, factual, and quietly devastated. The German engineers had not been defeated by American ingenuity. They had been defeated by American pragmatism, and they knew it. The families of those engineers carried the silence forward. Voorman survived the war and returned to civilian metallurgy, but he never published his wartime findings. Colleagues described him as haunted by something he refused to name. He died in 1971, leaving behind notebooks filled with calculations on armor-to-weight ratios that had no application in peacetime. The Hellcat itself became a symbol of a truth the Reich could not accept, that war is not won by the heaviest blow, but by the fastest, and that pride in engineering excellence is no defense against an enemy who understands production, logistics, and the ruthless mathematics of replacement. The disassembly at Kummersdorf was not an investigation. It was an autopsy of German doctrine performed while the patient was still breathing. The Hellcat arrived at Kummersdorf with mud still caked to its tracks and a hole punched clean through the turret ring, the result of a direct hit from a German 88mm gun during the vehicle's capture. The damage should have been catastrophic. In a Panther or Tiger, such a hit would have ignited ammunition, killed the crew, and rendered the vehicle unsalvageable. But the Hellcat's crew had escaped with minor injuries. The ammunition had not detonated, and the engine still turned over when German mechanics replaced the fuel lines. This alone troubled the examination team. The vehicle had been designed to fail gracefully, to absorb punishment without becoming a death trap. German tanks were not. They were built to win duels, not to retreat and survive. The philosophical gap was wider than any technical difference, and it was this gap that would consume the engineers over the following months. Dr. Heinrich Voorman had spent his career refining armor. He understood stress points, hardness gradients, the way molybdenum and nickel could be blended to resist penetration. He had contributed to the development of the Tiger II's frontal plate, 150 millimeters of hardened steel angled at 50 degrees. It could stop any Allied shell at range. It also weighed 7 tons by itself. The Hellcat's entire hull weighed less than that. Voorman's first task was to determine whether the Americans had discovered a new alloy or simply accepted vulnerabilities that German doctrine would never tolerate. The answer, he found, was both. The armor was not revolutionary. It was ordinary rolled homogeneous steel, heat-treated and welded with standard techniques. What made it effective was placement. The Hellcat's designers had armored only what was necessary: the crew compartment, the engine bay, the ammunition storage, and left the rest exposed. This was heresy to German engineering, which insisted on comprehensive protection. Voorman's team cut samples from the hull and tested them under laboratory conditions. The results were consistent. The steel had a tensile strength comparable to mid-grade German armor plate, but it was thinner, lighter, and easier to produce. It would not stop a direct hit from a Panzerfe's 75mm gun at close range, but it did not need to. The Hellcat's speed allowed it to engage from distance, fire and withdraw before retaliation. This was not cowardice, it was efficiency. Vorman understood this intellectually, but it violated every instinct he had developed as an engineer. Armor was meant to protect. The Hellcat's armor was meant to delay death long enough for the crew to inflict damage and escape. The distinction was unbearable. It meant the German tanks, with their layered steel and complex suspensions, were overbuilt relics designed for a war that no longer existed. Klaus Ritter, the welding specialist, focused on the vehicle's construction. German tanks were assembled with precision, each plate fitted and welded by skilled workers in factories designed for quality over speed. The Hellcat had been welded quickly, with visible seams and occasional gaps that would have failed German quality inspections. Yet the vehicle held together. Ritter tested the welds under stress and found them adequate, not perfect, but sufficient. This was the American method: good enough, fast enough, cheap enough. Ritter's notes from December 1944 reveal his growing frustration. He wrote, "We have been taught that excellence is non-negotiable. The Americans have proven that adequacy, when mass-produced, defeats excellence every time." His supervisors ordered him to focus on technical findings and avoid philosophical commentary. He complied. But the commentary continued in private letters that were never sent. The examination team also studied the Hellcat's engine. The Continental R975 was a 9-cylinder radial originally designed for aircraft. It produced 400 horsepower, ran on lower-grade fuel than German engines, and required minimal maintenance. German tank engines were liquid-cooled inline designs that demanded constant attention and high-octane fuel. The R975 was air-cooled, which eliminated the need for radiators, coolant lines, and the vulnerabilities they introduced. It was louder, less refined, and brutally simple. Vorman's team disassembled it completely and found no innovations, only intelligent compromises. The Americans had not invented better engineering. They had invented better priorities. They had asked, what is the minimum complexity required to achieve maximum effect? Germany had never asked that question. Germany had asked, what is the maximum performance we can extract from available resources? The Hellcat answered a question Germany had not thought to pose. By January 1945, the examination had become an ordeal. The engineers knew their findings would be ignored. The war was collapsing. Factories were rubble. The labor force was gone. Even if Germany could replicate the Hellcat, there was no time, no steel, no fuel. The report they were compiling was an epitaph, not a blueprint. Vorman's colleague, an engineer named Stefan Kurtz, collapsed from exhaustion in mid-January and was hospitalized with what doctors called nervous strain. He did not return to Kummersdorf. His replacement, a younger engineer named Otto Brandt, read the accumulated findings and requested a transfer within a week. He was denied. The work continued because orders required it, not because anyone believed it mattered. The Hellcat sat in the examination bay, stripped to its frame, a skeleton of a philosophy that had already won. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. The technical drawings produced at Kummersdorf between November 1944 and February 1945 filled 3 leather-bound volumes, each page annotated with measurements, stress calculations, and metallurgical analyses. The drawings were meticulous. They captured every angle of the Hellcat's construction, from the torsion bar suspension to the semi-automatic transmission, from the gun breech assembly to the fuel tank placement. But the drawings also captured something unintentional, the growing realization among German engineers that they had been solving the wrong problems for the entire war. The Hellcat was not superior because of better materials or advanced technology. It was superior because it had been designed with a clear understanding of what modern armored warfare required. Germany had designed tanks to dominate battlefields. America had designed tank destroyers to end battles quickly. The distinction was fatal. Dr. Heinrich Vormann's personal notebooks, recovered after his death in 1971, reveal the psychological toll of the examination. In an entry dated December 3, 1944, he wrote, "We have spent years perfecting armor that can resist any shell. The Americans have built a vehicle that does not need to resist. It moves too quickly to be targeted. When did speed become more valuable than protection? When did survival become more important than victory?" The questions were rhetorical, but they haunted him. Vormann had dedicated his career to the belief that engineering excellence could compensate for numerical inferiority. The Hellcat proved that belief was a luxury afforded only to nations with time and resources. Germany had neither. The Reich had bet on quality, and America had flooded Europe with adequacy. The adequacy was winning. Klaus Ritter, the welding specialist, began documenting not just the Hellcat's construction, but the implications of its design philosophy. In a confidential memo dated January 8, 1945, he argued that Germany's armored doctrine had become a liability. He wrote, "We build tanks as if each one must survive the entire war. The Americans build tank destroyers as if each one must survive a single engagement. They accept losses because they can replace losses. We cannot accept losses because we cannot replace anything." The memo was read by Ritter's immediate supervisor, a colonel named Ernst Keller, who agreed with every word and ordered it destroyed. Keller explained in a conversation Ritter later recounted to his brother that the memo's conclusions were correct and therefore dangerous. To acknowledge that German doctrine was flawed would be to acknowledge that the war was already lost. The examination continued, but its findings were increasingly treated as classified embarrassments rather than actionable intelligence. The Hellcat suspension system became a particular source of frustration. German tanks used overlapping road wheels and interleaved suspension, a design that provided excellent stability but was nightmarishly complex to maintain. In winter conditions, mud and ice froze between the wheels, immobilizing entire vehicles until crews could chip away the blockage. The Hellcat used simple torsion bars and individual road wheels, a design that prioritized ease of repair over theoretical perfection. When a Hellcat threw a track, the crew could replace it in under an hour. When a Panther threw a track, it often required a recovery vehicle and a full day of labor. Vormann's team tested the Hellcat's suspension under simulated combat conditions and found it adequate for rapid maneuver, but vulnerable to sustained rough terrain. The Americans had accepted this trade-off. They knew the Hellcat would not last forever. They knew it did not need to. Otto Brandt, the young engineer who replaced Stefan Kurz, was assigned to analyze the Hellcat's fire control system. The system was rudimentary by German standards, a simple telescopic sight with manual range estimation and no ballistic computer. German tank destroyers used advanced optics and range-finding equipment that allowed for precise long-range engagements. The Hellcat's crew relied on experience, instinct, and the knowledge that they could fire, observe the impact, adjust, and fire again before the enemy could respond. Brandt's report concluded that the American system was inferior in precision but superior in practical application. His supervisor crossed out the word superior and replaced it with sufficient. The edit was minor, but it reflected the larger denial. German engineers could not admit that simplicity had defeated sophistication. To do so would be to invalidate every decision made since 1939. By late January, the examination had become a ritual without purpose. The engineers knew the report would never influence production. The factories that could have built lighter, faster vehicles were gone. The steel that could have been reallocated was already committed to projects that would never be completed. The Hellcat sat in the examination bay, a monument to efficiency that Germany could study but never replicate. Vormann's final entry in his personal notebook, dated February 10, 1945, was a single sentence. "We learned everything except how to learn quickly enough." The examination concluded 3 days later. The Hellcat was loaded onto a rail car and sent west toward American lines in a final attempt to prevent its recapture by Soviet forces. The rail car was destroyed in an air raid. The technical report survived, but the men who wrote it did not survive the truth it contained. The engineers at Kummersdorf were not soldiers. They were metallurgists, welders, draftsmen, and physicists who had been conscripted into the machinery of total war. Most had entered the examination of the captured Hellcat with professional curiosity, expecting to confirm German superiority or identify incremental improvements. What they found instead was a mirror held up to their own obsolescence. The Hellcat was not a better tank destroyer. It was the answer to a question Germany had refused to ask. What happens when the enemy can build 10 vehicles in the time it takes you to build one? The engineers understood this within weeks. Their superiors understood it and chose silence. The divergence between technical truth and institutional denial created a psychological fault line that fractured the examination team. Dr. Heinrich Vormann was 51 years old in 1944, old enough to remember Germany before the First War, young enough to have believed in the promises of the Second. He had joined the Armaments Ministry in 1936, convinced that German engineering could forge a future free from the humiliations of Versailles. For 8 years, he had worked to perfect armor plate, to make steel harder, lighter, more resilient. The Hellcat proved that all of this had been a sophisticated waste of time. The Americans had not perfected armor. They had sidestepped the problem entirely by building vehicles too fast to be targeted and too numerous to be stopped. Vormann's wife, Ilse, later recalled that he stopped sleeping in January 1945. He would sit at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, occasionally muttering calculations that had no meaning outside the collapsing logic of the war. She asked him once what troubled him. He said, "I have spent my life making things stronger. They have spent theirs making things faster. I was wrong." Klaus Ritter was younger, 34, with a wife and 2 daughters in Hamburg. He had been trained as a precision welder and took pride in the quality of his work. German tanks were welded with care, each seam inspected, each joint stress-tested. The Hellcat's welds were rough, uneven, sometimes incomplete, yet the vehicle functioned. Ritter tested the welds repeatedly, trying to find the failure point that would justify dismissing the design. He found none. The welds were adequate, and adequacy was enough. In a letter to his wife dated December 22, 1944, he wrote, "I have learned that perfection is a trap. The Americans do not waste time on perfection. They waste time on nothing." The letter arrived in Hamburg 3 weeks later. By then, Ritter had stopped writing. His wife never learned why. When the war ended, she searched for him among the survivors. She found only silence. Stefan Kurtz, the engineer who collapsed from nervous strain, was removed from the examination in mid-January and placed under medical observation. His physician, Dr. Anton Heller, noted in his records that Kurtz exhibited symptoms of severe anxiety and spoke repeatedly about the mathematics of replacement. Kurtz had calculated, using the Hellcat examination data and known American production figures, that the United States could replace every tank destroyer lost in Europe within 6 weeks. Germany could not replace a single Panther in the same time frame. Kurtz told Dr. Heller that the war was not being fought on battlefields but in factories, and Germany had already lost. Heller prescribed rest and sedatives. Kurtz was discharged in February and sent to a labor battalion on the Eastern Front. He did not return. His family received notification of his death in April 1945. The cause was listed as combat-related injuries. No details were provided. Otto Brandt, the young engineer assigned after Kurtz's collapse, had been trained in optical systems and believed in the superiority of German precision. The Hellcat's fire control system shattered that belief. It was crude, manual, and effective. Brandt's report, submitted in early February, concluded that American tank destroyers relied on speed of engagement rather than accuracy of first shot. This was not a flaw. It was a doctrine. Brandt understood, perhaps more clearly than his older colleagues, that the war had shifted away from duels between individual vehicles and toward overwhelming volume of fire. He wrote in his report, "We have designed instruments for a war of skill. They have designed instruments for a war of attrition. Skill cannot outlast attrition." His supervisor, Colonel Ernst Keller, read the report and told Brandt to revise it. Brandt refused. Keller filed the original report and assigned Brandt to administrative duties. Brandt survived the war and emigrated to Argentina in 1947. He never worked in engineering again. The examination team dissolved in February 1945 as Soviet forces closed on Berlin. Vormann was evacuated west and spent the final months of the war in a technical facility near Munich, translating salvaged documents that no one read. Ritter disappeared into the chaos of the retreat. Kurtz was dead. Brandt was reassigned. The men who had dissected the Hellcat scattered, carrying with them the knowledge that German armored doctrine had been defeated not by better tanks, but by better questions. The truth they uncovered was archived, classified, and forgotten. Decades later, when the documents were declassified, historians noted the tone of the reports, clinical, precise, and quietly despairing. The engineers had not been defeated by American technology. They had been defeated by American pragmatism, and they had known it in real time. The war ended. The steel remained. The technical report on the captured M18 Hellcat was completed on February 13, 1945, and submitted to the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office, in Berlin. It consisted of 412 pages of detailed analysis, including cross-sectional diagrams, metallurgical test results, performance comparisons with German tank destroyers, and a concluding section that recommended a complete overhaul of German armored vehicle doctrine. The report was read by 3 senior officials, stamped Classified Technical Intelligence, and filed in a secure archive beneath the Bendler Block complex. 6 weeks later, Soviet artillery reduced the Bendler Block to rubble. The archive was buried. The report was presumed destroyed. It resurfaced in 1946, recovered by American intelligence officers sifting through salvaged German documents in the ruins of Berlin. It was translated, catalogued, and sent to a storage facility in Maryland, where it remained unread for 27 years. The report's conclusions were unambiguous and unforgiving. It stated that the Hellcat represented a fundamental reorientation of armored warfare principles away from individual vehicle superiority and toward logistical and tactical flexibility. It noted that the vehicle's light armor, high speed, and ease of production made it more strategically valuable than technically superior but resource-intensive German designs. It recommended that Germany immediately cease production of heavy tank destroyers and transition to lighter, faster vehicles using simplified components and standardized parts. The recommendations were never implemented. By February 1945, Germany lacked the industrial capacity, raw materials, and time to implement any recommendations. The report was not a blueprint for reform. It was an autopsy performed on a doctrine that had already died. Dr. Heinrich Vormann's contribution to the report was the metallurgical analysis of the Hellcat's armor. He had tested samples under controlled conditions, subjecting them to high-velocity impacts, thermal stress, and shear forces. His findings confirmed what he had suspected from the beginning. The armor was unremarkable. It was ordinary steel, heat-treated and rolled to standard specifications. What made it effective was not composition, but application. The Americans had abandoned the German principle of comprehensive protection and instead armored only critical areas, accepting vulnerability in exchange for weight reduction. Foreman's section concluded with a sentence that was underlined in red ink by one of the report's readers. The enemy has prioritized survival of doctrine over survival of individual vehicles. This is a strategic advantage we cannot counter with metallurgy alone. The underlining suggested that someone in the high command understood. The lack of action suggested that understanding changed nothing. Klaus Ritter's section focused on manufacturing processes. He had examined the Hellcat's welds, fasteners and assembly techniques, comparing them to German standards. His report was blunt. American production methods prioritize speed and volume over precision. Welds are adequate rather than perfect. Components are interchangeable rather than custom-fitted. The result is a vehicle that can be assembled by semi-skilled labor in a fraction of the time required for German equivalents. Ritter included photographs of the welds, annotated with notes on their irregularities. He also included a calculation. A single Hellcat could be produced in the time it took to manufacture the turret assembly of a Jagd Panther. The calculation was correct. It was also devastating. German industry could not compete with American mass production, and no amount of technical refinement could bridge the gap. Otto Brandt's analysis of the fire control system was the briefest section of the report, but it was the most philosophically damaging. He wrote, "The Hellcat's targeting system is inferior to German optical range-finding equipment in every measurable category. However, the vehicle's speed allows crews to engage, observe, adjust and re-engage before enemy forces can respond. Precision is rendered irrelevant by rapidity of fire. This represents a tactical evolution our current doctrine does not address." Brandt's supervisor had attempted to soften the language, but Brandt refused to revise. The final report included his original phrasing. Decades later, military historians would cite Brandt's section as one of the clearest articulations of the shift from precision warfare to maneuver warfare documented during the Second World War. At the time, it was filed and forgotten. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. The report concluded with a summary written by Colonel Ernst Keller, the senior officer overseeing the examination. Keller's summary was cautious, technical, and hopeless. He acknowledged that the Hellcat represented a significant doctrinal challenge, but noted that Germany lacked the resources to respond. He recommended continued study of captured Allied vehicles and gradual integration of simplified design principles into future production. There was no future production. Keller knew this. Everyone who read the report knew this. The summary was an exercise in procedural formality, a final gesture toward a professional standard that no longer applied. Keller survived the war, was briefly detained by American forces, and returned to civilian life in 1947. He never spoke publicly about the Hellcat examination. When asked by a journalist in 1963 about his wartime work, he said only, "We documented what we could not change." The report was declassified in 1973. By then, most of the men who wrote it were dead. The men who examined the Hellcat at Kummersdorf returned to their lives, or what remained of them, carrying knowledge that had no application in the post-war world. Dr. Heinrich Voormann resumed civilian metallurgy in 1946, working for a steel manufacturer in the Ruhr Valley. He never published his wartime findings. Colleagues described him as competent but distant, a man who performed his duties without enthusiasm and declined opportunities for advancement. His wife, Ilse, told her daughter years later that Voormann would sometimes stand in his workshop holding a piece of steel and say nothing for hours. When asked what he was thinking, he would reply, "I am thinking about weight." The daughter did not understand. Ilse did not explain. Voormann died in 1971 of heart failure. Among his personal effects were 6 notebooks filled with calculations on armor-to-weight ratios, stress tolerances, and production timelines for vehicles that were never built. The notebooks were archived by his family and donated to a technical university in 1998. Klaus Ritter's fate was less clear. His wife Anna received a letter from the Wehrmacht in May 1945 stating that Ritter had been declared missing during the evacuation of Kummersdorf. No body was recovered. No witnesses came forward. Anna spent 2 years searching for information, writing to former colleagues, military archives, and displaced persons offices. She received no answers. In 1950, she applied to have Ritter declared legally dead. The application was approved. Anna remarried in 1953 and moved to Frankfurt. She kept Ritter's letters in a locked box and read them once a year on the anniversary of his disappearance. In one letter dated January 1945, Ritter had written, "I have learned that there are truths which destroy the men who discover them. I have discovered such a truth. I do not know if I will survive it." Anna showed the letter to her second husband once. He read it and said nothing. She never showed it to anyone again. Stefan Kurz, the engineer who collapsed from nervous strain, was killed on the Eastern Front in March 1945. His death was recorded in a casualty list submitted by his unit, but no details of the circumstances were provided. His family received notification in June 1945. His mother Margarete requested his personal effects. None were returned. Margaret wrote to the military archive every year until her death in 1964, asking for information about her son's final days. The archive responded each time with the same statement: "Records from the final months of the war are incomplete. Further information is not available." In 1982, a historian researching the Kummersdorf facility found a reference to Kurtz in a partially destroyed logbook. The entry, dated January 15, 1945, read, "Engineer Kurtz removed from duty due to psychological collapse. Cause, prolonged exposure to classified technical findings. Prognosis, poor." The historian included the entry in a footnote. No one followed up. Otto Brandt emigrated to Argentina in 1947 under a resettlement program for displaced technical workers. He settled in Buenos Aires and worked as a bookkeeper for an import company. He never returned to engineering. In a letter to his sister in Germany, written in 1952, he explained, "I spent the war designing instruments of precision for a conflict that required only instruments of volume. I learned that excellence is no defense against inevitability. I have no desire to design anything again." Brandt married in 1955 and had 3 children. He lived quietly, avoided German expatriate communities, and refused to discuss his wartime service. In 1979, a German journalist researching the Hellcat examination tracked Brandt down and requested an interview. Brandt declined. When the journalist persisted, Brandt said, "I wrote a report in 1945 that no one read. I have nothing to add." He died in 1991. His children found a single document among his papers, a carbon copy of his fire control analysis from the Kummersdorf examination, annotated in the margins with the words, "They were faster because they did not waste time being perfect." The families of these men carried the silence forward. They did not speak of what their husbands and fathers had seen because they did not fully understand it themselves. The technical language of the reports, the diagrams of armor thickness and suspension geometry, the calculations of production rates and replacement timelines, these were abstractions to the families. What they understood was the silence. Vormann's refusal to discuss his work, Ritter's cryptic letters about truths that destroy, Kurtz's collapse and disappearance, Brandt's self-imposed exile from engineering. The silence was the inheritance, passed down through generations who knew only that something had broken their fathers during the war, and that the breaking had involved a vehicle called the Hellcat. When the Kummersdorf report was declassified in 1973, it was read by military historians and archived as a technical curiosity. The emotional weight of the document, the quiet despair in Foreman's metallurgical analysis, the bluntness of Ritter's manufacturing critique, the philosophical devastation in Brandt's fire control section, was noted but not explored. The men who wrote the report were names in a personnel roster. Their personal toll was not recorded in the official history. It was recorded in the margins of notebooks, in letters that were never sent, in the silence of widows who searched for husbands, who vanished into the collapse of an empire that had demanded everything and offered nothing in return. The Hellcat was disassembled, studied, and destroyed. The men who examined it were disassembled by what they learned, and no archive preserved what they lost. The M18 Hellcat that was captured near the Hürtgen forest and transported to Kummersdorf in the autumn of 1944 no longer exists. It was loaded onto a rail car in February 1945, sent west toward American lines, and destroyed in an Allied air raid near Magdeburg. The wreckage was never identified. The vehicle that had paralyzed German engineering doctrine for 4 months became scrap metal scattered across a rail yard that no one bothered to excavate. The technical report survived because it was paper, weightless, easily transported. The machine itself did not survive because it was steel, and steel is heavy. And by 1945, Germany had no capacity to preserve what it could not use. The irony was total. The Americans had built a vehicle designed to be disposable, and the Germans had tried to preserve it as a monument to their own obsolescence. The report was recovered by Captain James Lawson of the U.S. Army's Technical Intelligence Division in July 1946. Lawson was part of a team tasked with cataloguing captured German documents in the ruins of Berlin. He found the Hellcat report in a half-collapsed archive beneath what remained of the Bendler block. The pages were water-stained but legible. Lawson read the summary, recognized the significance, and flagged the document for translation. It arrived in Washington in October 1946 and was filed in the National Archives under the classification Captured Enemy Documents, Armored Vehicles. It remained there unread for 27 years. When it was declassified in 1973, a military historian named Dr. Robert Hollis included excerpts in a monograph on German armored doctrine. Hollis noted the report's tone, clinical, precise, and quietly despairing, but did not investigate the men who wrote it. They were names in a personnel roster. Their fates were not his concern. Dr. Heinrich Vormann's notebooks were donated to the Technical University of Darmstadt in 1998 by his daughter, who had inherited them after her mother's death. The notebooks contain calculations, sketches, and occasional personal reflections. In one entry, dated March 1947, Vormann wrote, "I have returned to civilian work, but I cannot escape the knowledge that I spent the war perfecting solutions to problems that did not matter. The Americans understood what mattered. We did not. This is the definition of defeat." The notebooks are stored in the university's archive and are available to researchers by appointment. Few have requested access. The mathematics of armor-to-weight ratios is no longer relevant to modern engineering, and the personal reflections of a defeated metallurgist are not considered historically significant. Klaus Ritter's letters to his wife, Anna, were preserved by her second husband after her death in 1989. The letters were donated to the German War Archives in 1995. They are stored in a climate-controlled facility in Freiburg and are accessible to researchers. In one letter, dated December 1944, Ritter wrote, "I am learning that precision is a form of arrogance. The Americans do not waste time on precision. They waste time on nothing. This is why they are winning." The letter is cited occasionally in studies of wartime morale and industrial psychology. It is not cited in studies of armored vehicle development. The connection between Ritter's psychological collapse and the Hellcat examination is documented but not emphasized. The archives prefer technical history to human history. Stefan Kurz left no personal papers. His mother's requests for information were denied. His death on the Eastern Front is recorded in a casualty list with no details. The logbook entry from Kummersdorf, discovered in 1982, is the only surviving reference to his breakdown. The entry is included in a footnote in a doctoral dissertation on German technical facilities during the war. The dissertation was published in 1984 and has been cited 3 times. Kurz's name appears once in the footnote with no further elaboration. He is a name, a date, and a single sentence about psychological collapse. The cause of the collapse is not explained. The report he helped write is not mentioned. The connection is lost. Otto Brandt's carbon copy of his fire control analysis, found among his papers after his death in 1991, was donated to the Bundesarchiv by his eldest son in 1993. The document is filed under Technical Reports, World War II, Enemy Equipment. It is available to researchers but rarely requested. The marginalia, the handwritten note about speed and perfection, is not catalogued separately. It is mentioned in one academic paper published in 2001 on the psychological impact of technological inferiority on Axis engineers. The paper notes that Brandt's annotation reflects a profound recognition of doctrinal obsolescence, but does not explore his post-war exile or refusal to continue engineering work. The human cost of the recognition is not considered relevant to the technical analysis. The Hellcat, that the Germans could not replicate, became one of the most successful tank destroyers of the war. Nearly 2,700 were produced between 1943 and 1944. They served in Europe and the Pacific, were exported to Allied nations, and remained in service with some countries into the 1970s. The vehicle was retired not because it failed, but because faster, more lethal designs replaced it. This was the American doctrine: build what works, use it until something better arrives, discard without sentimentality. The Germans built vehicles to last 1,000 years. The Americans built vehicles to last until the next model. The war proved which philosophy endured. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of the German engineers who examined the Hellcat and admitted what they could not build. We'll see you in the next video. The war ended, but the steel still carries the sound of what should never have been forged.